We'll get this show on the road. Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. Again, welcome to our new seminar series called Spring into Science, Queer Representation in Research. And it is my pleasure to introduce Alex Fitzpatrick. Alex is a zooarchaeologist and a completing PhD researcher at the University of Bradford. Her current research focuses on the funerary and ritual uses of animal bones in later prehistoric Scotland. More information can be found about Alex on her website, and I'll put that in the chat for everyone if you're interested. And just a reminder, if everyone could please mute themselves during the duration of the talk, that would be great. And if you do have any questions, we'll have a short Q&A session afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to pass this along to Alex. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah, I have no idea what Lucinda said when we started. So if she was trash talking me, that's fine. We know each other personally, so. Oh, I heard her. I don't know what's happening. Anyway, I'll get started with my talk. So let me just share my screen. Don't we all love this part of Zoom things when you have to make awkward small talk? Trying to get your screen to show. I promise you the talk will be somewhat worth it. Anyway, again, no idea what Lucinda said when she introduced me, but I assume she said that I am a zooarchaeologist at the University of Bradford. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But yeah, my talk is basically all about liminality, which is a bit of what I research. So kind of gonna put you in a little mood or something. You know, imagine that you're entering a cave on a sunny, warm summer day. There's a swift, distinct change in the temperature as you walk into the darkness, a cold dampness that really just cuts straight through the bone. You know, that lack of internal light immediately plunges you into darkness as you journey further into the cave. And the inherent stillness and silence, you know, means any noise you make is amplified twofold. If the underworld exists, this is likely where it would probably be. And yet, if you turn around, you face the entrance of the cave, you would be greeted by a completely different setting. You know, you would see that bright sun, that clear blue sky. By walking back to the start, you can already feel the warm air, hear the natural noises that one associates with the outdoors. But if you stop right in the middle between the entrance of the cave and its deeper chambers in that darkness, you are in between what can only be described as two completely different worlds. And that is what we call a liminal space. And it's where I exist, both as a researcher and as a queer mixed woman. So a little bit about me. There I am. I think I knew I was queer pretty early on in my life. One of my first crushes on a girl was probably at some point in primary school, and I was brought up in theater and dance circles, so I was pretty much introduced to gay culture really early in my life. But despite all that, I really struggled in, finding a comfortable identifier for the way I felt. By the end of high school, I think I may have told like one or two people that I was probably bisexual, but otherwise I kept that to myself. It had only been kind of recently. Ooh. My bad. That's me, clumsy queer. Anyway, it only been kind of recently that I felt confident enough to really, claim queer as an identity. But I also never really came out of the closet. It was more of like a quiet kind of shuffle into the world. It's like, when you get to a party and everyone don't want to make a big deal, so you kind of just like shuffle into the middle of it. That's basically how I embraced my queerness. I mean, like the people who knew me knew, and that was always kind of enough to me. And to be fair, personal identity has always been really difficult for me to parse. Although I'm mixed, my mom's from China, my dad is white, I was always read as completely Asian, or at the very least non-white, growing up in a predominantly white town on Long Island, New York. So most of my childhood and teenage years were spent trying to kind of, assimilate into the whiteness that surrounded me. My Chinese part of my family were very much bought into the idea of Americanizing themselves, which looking back on it is pretty tragic. But, I forgoed much of my cultural upbringing and, tried to exchange that forgetfulness for acceptance. And yet there was never truly any acceptance among my white peers. I continued to bear the brunt of racist jokes and harassment from others, regardless of how much white eyeliner I used to put underneath my eyes to make them look bigger and less Asian looking. Yeah, cringe. So perhaps it's ultimately unsurprising that this disconnect would, become further entrenched into my psyche and disrupt my understanding of other aspects of my identity. And it wasn't until I began my PhD research that I really began to understand and confront my multiple identity crises. So my project was centered around the Cowsey Caves. They're caves that are situated on the coast of the Moray Firth in Scotland. And here are some beautiful pictures of the caves themselves, and just kind of a picture here of what I mostly work with as an archaeologist. I mostly work with animal bones. So archaeological excavations here in these caves had already revealed what had been interpreted as a later prehistoric mortuary complex, where intricate funerary rites were likely performed among and with the dead. This was actually further complicated by the presence of both human and animal remains. So this kind of suggested that ritual activity was occurring, perhaps connected to the kind of funerary activity that was already happening with these later prehistoric people. So as a trained zooarchaeologist, my role was to examine the faunal remains from the Cowsey Caves and, kind of decipher the relevance to the human activities within the caves. This was eventually determined focused taphonomic investigation, so kind of looking at how the bones were processed, what humans and other animals, of course, were doing with these remains, things like that, as well as comparative analysis with the human remains from the same sites. So the kind of resulting interpretation revealed a really, really complex narrative in which the Cowsey Caves were actually an incredibly important place for ritual and funerary activities, from as early as the Neolithic period to as late as the post-medieval period. So where does this all get, make sense with my queerness? Well, the Cowsey Caves were considered to be liminal spaces, potentially as an area between the living world and the world of the dead. This was established mostly by using a kind of framework based on a definition by Van Gennep, where he describes liminality as a transitional state between the separation from one world and the further incorporation of another world. The definition was actually really useful in looking at the funerary character at the Cowsey Caves, as, when you have rites for the dead, these are often used to kind of transform the body from something, unclean or something along those lines into something more purified for transport into the underworld. So what made the Cowsey Caves so unique, even among other liminal spaces, and of course, it's not the only liminal space, archaeologically speaking, was how its liminality was not defined just to, the spatial awareness, the spatiality. It was also spaces of temporal liminality, in that when we looked at the archaeological record, you saw this kind of significant, intentional intermixing of material from different periods left by human visitors. And this goes from, some examples would be, we found a bunch of animal bones that had a juvenile human hip bone placed on top of it. All the animal bones were dated to the medieval period, but the hip bone was from the late Bronze Age. So you had people coming in here seeing these like really interesting osteological collections and kind of making their own ritual deposits, which is so fascinating. And it also includes modern day visitors. One of the caves, Sculptor's Cave, has a little, what's now kind of an altar. It's this small rock enclosure that people who have been going into these caves, because they're obviously open to the public, they've been leaving behind pebbles and, random sticks and animal bones put there. And it's a really incredible case of, again, this kind of temporal liminality, this cave existing in so many different periods and still having this kind of significance from this huge span of time, with varying similarities of use. And, there's also kind of the overall characteristics of the caves can be considered liminal, in that it's somewhere between a place of ritual activity and kind of the more mundane domestic behaviors that are associated with later prehistoric life. So this is something that an archaeologist by the name of Richard Bradley kind of talks about in the later prehistoric, in that, you get these, what we would call domestic sites, but there's these really interesting kind of ritual things happening here. And he talks about how, at this point, rituals are occurring in domestic spaces. You can't actually properly differentiate between the two. So in its own way, you're constantly working in this liminal space where you can't really, categorize things so neatly, which again, I find extremely fascinating. And it's these intersections of liminal identities within the Cowsey Caves resonated with me as a person of very similar, well, not entirely similar. I'm not a place of ritual, although maybe like spiritually I am, but as someone who does have these kind of intersecting and complicated identities, all this really resonated with me. So as I continued my research and developed my interpretations, I was able to see how difficult it was to place the sites into any particular classification. Were they simply funerary sites? Were they just ritual sites? Further analysis of the faunal bone kind of complicated this even more. If we are extending use to the post-medieval period, is this still a later prehistoric site? Because there's so much bone modification and potential feasting activity happening with animal bones, are we, looking at something more domestic? What appear to be contradictions were ultimately part of what is a complicated reality, one that reflects the realities and messiness inherent in life. And thus I saw myself in these caves and realized that I was also extremely complicated and messy. And I realized that I could embrace that. For me, embracing queerness was embracing a form of liminality. And of course, I should note, I am not the first, nor will I be the last to use liminality as a framework for identity, particularly in queer theory. In fact, liminality is arguably a vital, important component of queer theory, as Lauren March writes in a recent paper that just came out. Liminality brings together queer ways of thinking through unboundedness, spillage, fluidity, multiplicity, and processes of contingent, non-linear becoming, as well as the relations of power and regulation that seek their stability or closure. So, liminality has been used to to situate discussions of sexualities, queer identities, intercommunal marginalization, and those kind of intersections that queerness has with other modalities. And on the screen are just kind of examples of, there's so many examples of liminality being used as a framework for examining queerness. But above all, liminality is a form of resistance. Lemaster in their 2011 paper wrote that liminality is a form of resistance to assimilation, essentialism, privacy, and heteronormativity. And I think that really fits, especially when you look at it from the kind of perspective that I've been looking at it from my research. So, embracing the liminality of myself has actually allowed me to embrace queerness as my main identifier. Like, sure, if you ask me to have to pick a proper name, I usually will say that it kind of aligns with pansexuality, but being able to identify as queer and all that the word entails has been much more freeing. And in living through queerness and the liminal spaces that encompasses the rest of my life, and in this case, my research, I see boundless potential for future reconciliation with the past and growth for the future. So yeah, thank you for listening. These are all my garbage. If you want to find me, let me stop sharing. And yeah, thank you for being here. I'm sure Lucinda will say something that I can't hear.
Well, if you can hear me now.
I can hear you.
Yay. Okay, well, thank you. That was a really interesting talk. And I really love this idea of relating your queerness to the liminality of the spaces that you work in, because for myself as well, I find I didn't realize I was queer until my 20s. And it was a really complex situation because I had always thought of myself as straight. And then to come into this space, not understanding all the complexities of it, that I can come into the space thinking I'm straight and then finding out all of these other identities alongside of myself. It's really interesting that you saw that in the caves. And I like that idea.
I mean, we did share a liminal space once in Scotland in 2014. So
yes, we did. For people who aren't following along, I met Alex doing work for what was it, the Know of Swandro, right?
Yeah, your brief archaeology.
Yeah, we did some archaeology for the summer together.
And I would say that the hole that we were literally stuck in for an entire week was a liminal space between me losing my absolute marbles and coming out of there in one piece. But no, I'm so happy to have been invited to do this because I've never really thought of all this has been something that's been resting on my subconscious. So being able to kind of flesh this out has been really interesting. And also I don't really get to talk about this stuff because I work with dead things, and you don't really get to talk about that with dead animals, at least.
So if anybody has any questions, I could read them from the chat or you can unmute yourselves, but we do have one here that I'll read to you, Alex. It says, did you expect to find so many parallels between your research and your identity?
I mean, not really. Again, as a Asian American migrant, okay, my family is from Hong Kong, which, as many of you probably know, formerly a colony of Britain. So I like to view me coming to the UK to do my research as reverse colonization. But yeah, obviously, I didn't necessarily think to see myself in what was pitched to me as, later prehistoric ritual and funerary rites. And again, I'm a zooarchaeologist, so I'm really usually looking at animals. But the nice thing about archaeology is that because it has to do with our past, our collective past, that means that there's so much you can talk about. And it is actually so much more relatable than you think. And I think caves in particular are very interesting because you are literally, a lot of archaeological sites you're working on, they're all ruins that you're kind of digging down into. The caves you're absolutely encompassed into, and it's more or less kind of be the same experience that people in the past had. So I think it was a much more engrossing experience, and I think that got me in the mindset a bit more. But yeah, also you spend a couple of hours in caves, you start thinking about other things.
Yeah, definitely. Being in those spaces really makes you think. I do remember thinking a lot when I was staring at that wall that I was digging out for hours and
Well, we
hours.
were mostly thinking about how if we cover ourselves in mud like elephants did,
Would
we
we
would
cool down?
we would cool down. And look at us now, basically on our way to getting PhDs. If that's not an inspirational story to anyone.
Okay, does anybody else have questions? We're more than happy to have you unmute yourselves if you want to ask it directly. Okay, Cass, if you want to unmute yourself, otherwise I can read it from the chat. All right, I guess I will read it from the chat. So Cass asks, do you find it reassuring to view liminality and queerness as inherent human experiences shared with people so long ago?
I do actually. I mean, one of the things when I was writing and like thinking about what I wanted to talk about was, I don't do queer archaeology. I am a queer archaeologist, but doing queer archaeology in itself is a completely different thing in the same way that I think most, you know, queer folks, I don't think know the ins and outs of queer theory per se. Obviously, we have our own lived experiences, but it's not the same. So I was thinking about like, oh, I don't have much to talk about in terms of queer archaeology because I don't know that theory that well. But there's this kind of idea, the idea of it though is very intriguing to me because of course, queerness and liminality is ultimately something as old as time itself and showcases in its own kind of ways. So even just kind of having that open mind and like approaching these subjects with that open mind is extremely, reassuring to me as someone who's still kind of like not sure about, identities and things like that, and even though I feel very comfortable now in saying that I'm a queer woman, a queer cis woman, obviously there's still some doubt, as I'm also like notoriously bad at making up my mind. So,
Great. Does anybody else have any questions?
and if for some reason you have a question, listen, just kind of put my information if you want to
Yeah,
send me an angry email.
I put Alex's website in the chat. It's really interesting. She runs a lot of blog posts and does SciComm all the time. So more than welcome to go look that up and chat with her. Oh, great. We have another question. So what are you planning on doing with your research in this field post PhD, if you have any plans yet?
Wow, I can't believe my mom's on this chat. No, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing too. And I think a lot of the struggle, if we're talking about liminality and in being in between places, I am surely in a liminal place right now. I want to very much be in academia still. I defended my PhD in December. I'm doing my corrections. They should hopefully be done in August. So then at that point, I'm really looking for, grants and stuff. There's the problem I feel like with archaeology in particular is that I could come up with like 3 million project ideas because again, archaeology is about everything really. So you could do a project about everything. So I've got some stuff I'm working on putting grants and stuff like that, but hopefully I'll be working on some extinct animals and looking at archival stuff with extinct animals. Again, fingers crossed. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But otherwise, I guess I'll just be trucking here for as long as I can. I was gonna say something else. Now I've already forgotten about it. Oh, about my website. I will post a transcript of this onto my website without the ums and uhs in it. I'll post that like next week and I'll have references in case you're interested and want to look further into these references and things like that, because I always write out these talks because if I don't, it'll all go into a mess.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm sure everyone would be happy to have that afterwards. Any other questions? I think I have one final question basically, I know I'm sort of in a similar boat as you. We're both doing or finishing up our PhDs, figuring out our queerness along the way. What would you say to others sort of trying to navigate their queerness in research? Because I know it can be difficult because I also have not expressed it so openly to most people until about now.
Yeah.
And it's a hard space to navigate, knowing that realizing you're queer either really late or just not knowing how to talk about that in the realms of research and your professionalism, essentially.
I mean, like, I think at the end of the day, it's just about finding your community, even if it's not necessarily a particular queer community, but just finding a community that you can kind of work these things out with is really important. Because, there's part of me that wants to be like, the world is basically ending, so you might as well just get it out while you can. But, that's not a particularly practical or safe thing to say to anyone. But I think kind of one of the things that really did help me was meeting people like Lucinda, like other people who I know were also kind of on this journey. For some reason, there's loads of us who are all PhD students. I don't know if there's something intrinsic about the PhD that makes everyone realize that they're kind of queer, but it's good to have those kind of communications and just being able to talk this. And again, as someone who's mixed, it's been good to talk with other people of color who have had similar kind of experiences, because it's a very specific thing. Obviously all of our experiences will be different, and some people will have more welcoming communities to go to than others. So just kind of finding your thing. And the good thing about, social media and the internet is that it's easier every day. Unfortunately, we all can't meet up on Tumblr like we used to, but I don't know how these future queers meet up with each other if they don't have Tumblr.
TikTok, I think.
uh, uh.
Oh, we have another question if you're happy to answer, because we still have plenty of time. So you mentioned that your family's not always celebrated the Chinese parts of your heritage. Have you found ways to identify with that part of yourself and the mixed part of yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple years ago, I became a practicing Taoist. I've really embraced it spiritually. I've been learning the languages again, things like that. And it's been kind of nice because I think I've also been forcing my mother to do it along the way. It's been nice to kind of embrace it and kind of push back a bit against the, need to assimilate with other white people. So it's been nice. And I think also, again, reaching out and finding queer Asians who have, including, there's a couple of friends of mine, queer Asians in archaeology. We have so much to talk about in terms of, dealing with how racist the field is, dealing with our own queerness and kind of the Chinese norms that we kind of have ingrained in us, and uplifting the queer Asian community itself. It's been really nice. So yeah, basically having a midlife crisis in my 20s with my identity and kind of sorting it out along the way. But there was a pandemic well, there's still a pandemic, but we were all home last year and I had a lot of time to kind of work this out finally.
I feel like the PhD is the time where you have that crisis of identity.
Yeah, because I mean, like, it's so much of like part of the PhD, and I think this goes across like all fields. That you're always told like, oh, this is when you show yourself as an academic, as a researcher. So you already have that as an intrinsic part of it. You're supposed to be showing who you are as an academic, and I think for a lot of us, what that ends up happening is you going, wait, I'm not just an academic, there's other parts of me. And I've noticed other people, even people who aren't queer, realize other things like, oh, actually, I'm really interested in sewing, or really interested in knitting, or I really like painting, actually, because you end up having to like force yourself, especially after the PhD, when you're kind of just like, oh, I'm not a student anymore, I'm kind of like a person, kind of realizing these aspects about you that you haven't thought about because you've been in school for like a decade, you know? So yeah, I guess maybe the PhD itself is just kind of its own liminal space of identity. I should get paid by how many times I get to use the word liminal. I know it's a lot in my thesis. I forgot what my corrections were, but I'm sure that's probably a note that's like, you use liminal too much. Can you tell?
Are you thinking of maybe exploring queer archaeology a bit? after your PhD, or you're going to focus on the zooarchaeological stuff that you've been
I'm focusing on the zooarch stuff, mostly also because I am also interested in the post-humanist approach to zooarchaeology. So there's some very threads in that, but queer archaeology in of itself is a very kind of lit heavy field that I think at this point I'm just kind of not into, you know what I mean? Like it's another part of archaeology in the same way I guess you'd be like, oh, you're a bird person, and you wouldn't necessarily be like, well, next thing I do is snakes, you know? That's how biology works, right?
yeah.
I only work with the dead ones, so like I'm expected to know all of them. But yeah, like it's its own thing. But again, there are similar threads, and I think there's a bit of an overlap, especially if you go into the more abstract conceptual stuff in zooarchaeology, which I like doing because I don't know, it means like there's less reason for me to be wrong.
Working with dead things can't do much wrong, can you?
I'm not gonna say anything. Those dead animals I work with.
Yeah, mine have a lot to say. But
I know. I work with birds too, and I despise them.
Does anybody else have any other questions? I think we could wrap up in a few minutes, if not. Have anything else you want to add, Alex? Or
Not really. Just glad people showed up to hear me talk. Hope that resonated with anyone. And good luck with everything. It's a tough time to be doing anything really, but in particular, being a PhD student, being in academia, being an early career researcher, it's extremely tough. And of course, if you're queer, it's an extremely tough world that that we are existing in right now. So, love and solidarity to everyone. Kind of it.
all right, well, great. Thank you so much for coming. It was really interesting, and happy to have you start out our seminar series.